For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael McSheehan. I'm with the National Swift Education Center. Our work as a national center is to provide technical assistance to states, districts, schools, to bring together academic, behavioral, social, emotional supports through a lens that we call equity-based inclusive education. And we're going to land on that notion of what is inclusion in a new definition by the end of this session. That's our vision for it. We're currently working with lots of states around the country. We're so excited to be partnered with Indiana in this work now. They've now lit up on our map. So you can see we're working with New Hampshire and Vermont, Maryland, Mississippi, Oregon. Those were our original states, and now Washington. Just a small statewide project in California with all schools. And Indiana now, red on our map. So we're really excited to be here and be partnered with you. In this session, and I guess we have like, what, 65 minutes or something? We're going to explore the elements of PBIS, RtI, Inclusion, MTSS, talk a little bit about similarities and differences, and hopefully in that process address some questions that you've probably brought about these 4 sets of letters. And then land on describing 5 domains of equity-based inclusive education. Who do I have in the room? So how many of you are general education teachers? Great. How many of you are special education teachers? Great. How many of you are related service providers? Speech, OT, social work, school counselor, psych? Great, 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 great. Glad you're here. Administrators, building level, school level administrators? District level administrators, co-op administrators. Okay, great. Okay. And family members of anybody? We're going to start off with some interaction and some generation of knowledge in the room. You are not tested on this. You're going to co-construct with your neighbors, and it's going to be fine. We're going to start off with a focus on RtI, PBIS, and inclusion. And kind of what we want to do is to figure out what knowledge there is in the room on those 3 sets of things before I start providing any direct instruction on something maybe that you already know. Like, let's not waste that time. So we're going to do a quick knowledge generation activity, staying in brainstorm mode. We're not going to freak out if we kind of have it close, but it's not really, I know it has a different word to it, like get close enough, that's fine in this next activity. Don't worry if your teammates don't completely agree with you. You're going to stay in brainstorm mode. So anybody comes up with an idea in the group, who's ever got the marker and who's writing for the group, you're just going to write it down. Okay. So we're going to break you into 3 groups, and you're each going to have a chance at the 3 very formal stations that we have set up around the room. A station on PBIS over there, a station on RtI over here, a station on inclusion in the back over there. So I'm going to break you into 3s. In your groups, you're going to have a couple of minutes in your groups to first brainstorm what you think it is. And I'm actually going to kind of do a loop around the room for just brainstorming what you think it is. And at each station, you're going to get a chance to kind of review what other people have come up with. And if you're on board, you agree with that thing that they wrote, just put a little plus next to it. If you've got some questions about what they wrote, just put a little question mark next to it. So pluses and question marks will be our tools as we're rotating. And then we'll do another round through to see if there are questions about certain things. So let's start off by counting off in 3s. In 3s. Do you want to start us off, Julie? 1. Okay. So 1s, we're going to start you off with green, and you're going to start off with the PBIS station. And Julie, you don't have to be the note taker, but identify somebody in your group who can write in a way that other people might have a higher likelihood of reading it. 2, Mary, you're going to just find somebody in your group who's okay with the note taking. Diana, you're going to be 3 with the blues. All right, so 1s go to PBIS, 2s go to RtI over here, 3s go to inclusion in the back. You're just brainstorming keywords and phrases of what you think this is. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock once you're all located at your stations and have identified a note taker for your group. All right, that's 2 minutes. We're going to have you rotate. RtI, go up to inclusion. Inclusion, come down to PBIS. PBIS, go over to RtI. Review the prior group's list. Put a plus next to it if you agree with it. A question mark if you have some wonderings about what the heck they meant by that word. Take your pens with you because we want to get different colors on each of the charts. Remember, there are multiple pages behind your cover page. If you need more room to write, just pull off the top and go to the next page down. Ready, set. You're going to have 2.5 minutes, half a minute to review and do your pluses and questions, and then do some more addition. Go ahead now. Okay. Rotate again. Start off again. So inclusion is going to go to PBIS, PBIS to RtI, RtI to inclusion. Start by reviewing the full, in some cases 2 pages, put pluses and question marks next to items there. What you agree with, what are you questioning or wondering about? I'll put 2.5 minutes on the clock. For people who just joined, just fold into a group. That was very smooth of you, I saw that. 5 seconds, and then I'm going to give you a new prompt. All right, if you haven't already identified on your list, I picked it up from the RtI group, this is important to note. At your station where you are, just note, is this thing that you're writing about a school-wide framework, or is it an individual kid framework? Just note, is this school-wide or individual kids? You've already done it. You guys are good to go. Okay, so you're all adding that. All right, final rotation, inclusion to PBIS, PBS to RtI, RtI to inclusion.
We're circling back.
You're circling back. You're taking a look at all the new stuff that's been added. So you get a chance to do pluses and question marks for the new items. And then if you have anything else to add now that you've been at the other stations. Pour down as they
PBIS is a program that is school-wide, that is introduced early on to prevent behavior issues, and that all can be rewarded, even the good students.
Great. Thank you, Angelica. Who's talking over here? Excellent. What is RtI?
Well, we all know RTI means response to intervention, and it looks like we had quite a bit on ours too, but we agreed with just about everything. There were, when we came back around, either other groups or our group decided that we still had questions about whether it was academic focused on math and literacy, if it was preventative, if it really did close the gap for all kids, and if it truly was a prerequisite to testing and retention.
Great. Okay. Good facts, good wonderings. We like that. Off to the inclusion group. Oh, now you're pointing to somebody else. Go ahead, Brian.
Inclusion, it's here. Ready or not, current practice, definitely research-based. The word inclusion means all. Include all students regardless of their disabilities or abilities. Differentiation, accommodations, modifications, works on social and emotional development, and then the whole aspect of co-teaching and collaboration comes into play.
Excellent. Nice work. Give all your speakers a little round of applause. Okay, come on back and let's do a little reflection here. I'm going to give you a moment based on that round. I want you to write down questions you have about differentiating these 3 things. You've just done some key elements. Now, kind of make a line on a notepad. How are they the same? How are they different? And any questions you have about them that will help you clear up. So, similarities, differences. And then maybe at the bottom, just write, like, if I had the answer to this question, I could tell you whether or not that component was similar or different. Okay, let's do a little check-in. Let's do similarities first. And I'm just going to move across the room and have this section of the room report out. Any similarities you found across the three? Give me 2 from this section of the room. School-wide. 1, data-driven. Okay? Similarities from this row. All require intensive training. Research-based. Okay. Similarities here. A focus on interventions. Okay. Okay, so somewhere in here we know we're addressing a variety of needs: academic, social, emotional, behavior. Okay, great. Similarities?
But it requires time and planning and a strong team to monitor and make it follow through.
Excellent. So it requires team, planning, and monitoring of what you're doing. Excellent list, Angelica. Other similarities?
RtI and PBIS are about tiered intervention.
Okay, so 2 of them have a similarity about this notion of tiers going on. And the intent is TIERS, not TEARS, which hasn't always happened in implementation. So, differences among them. Differences that you're seeing, at least one difference from this group. Okay, so PBIS has more of a behavior focus, right? Behavior's kind of in the letters. RtI more for academics, so there's a difference. Yes, ma'am.
It's not as much individualized to a student as it is like the whole school.
Okay.
All following the same plan.
Okay, so in these 2, there's an intention of a part of it being a school-wide, everybody's getting and doing some of the same things, and then there's something else that happens after that. Okay, great. Differences here?
Outcomes, like the gap that we have that exists with what they're currently doing versus like the research that we know with inclusion for all.
Okay, so the outcomes are different from the 3 buckets that we have here. Yes, you had your hand up, so I'm calling you.
I mean, this is the similarity.
Okay, good, we're bubbling up. We got some question coming up there. Excellent. Right, because there's maybe how it was intended, and then how it's been used, which is clearing up some of the myths around each of these in order for us to move ahead to MTSS. So this is really helpful. Any other differences you saw that you'd like to call out? I feel so removed from you all. Yes? Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, true inclusion requires an IEP and the other 2 do not.
There we go. One requires an IEP from your perspective, the other 2 do not, which we're gonna challenge that, hopefully. Because that would suggest that inclusion is really about kids with disabilities and the other 2 are not. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's how it's ran in practice.
That's how it's run in practice. There we go. Okay, great. So let's do a little bit of teaching and then pause and do some more questions. So let me bring you through some thinking around RtI and behavior and inclusion. Actually, you know what? Yeah, I'll do this first and then inclusion. So when the work originally started, we started work in PBIS first, as far as it being named Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, which actually evolved out of this thing that was called Positive Behavioral Supports, which evolved out of what was called Positive Approaches to Behavioral Support. So we had positive approaches, evolved to positive behavioral supports, evolved to positive behavioral interventions and supports. And that took a good 15 years of an evolution. Positive approaches really were kind of that step into 2 things. One, if we put our attention on what it is we want people to be able to do, and we organize around what we want them to do, that's the thrust of the support that we're providing. Which is different than I'm going to ding you for the things that you're doing wrong, right? So it's a shift in attention. The other thing that came out of this, the other big point on the behavior side that we figured out is very similar, and I got this rule from Pat Miranda, and it's just stuck with me ever since. She's a wonderful international leader around behavioral support thinking, and she was the editor of the PBIS Journal for a while as well. And she talks about where you put your energy. So in positive approaches to behavior, 95% of your energy goes into prevention. preventing the behavior. So something occurs, yes, of course you have to respond in that moment, and then you step back and you're like, how could we have prevented that? What would the prevention have looked like? That's what we want to build. And then 5% of the energy goes into response. In traditional behavioral approaches, that was flipped. It was very much 95% of the energy was in response, in consequence orientations, right? Whereas in PBIS, 95% of our energy is paying attention to things like antecedent interventions, environmental arrangements, human arrangements, material arrangements that might prevent. Good direct instruction that will help prevent, which was a core element in school-wide PBIS, where you would be expected to identify 3 to 5 school-wide behavioral expectations. These were expectations that you were going to hold for all kids in your system. And then you would take those 3 to 5 behavioral expectations and you would matrix them out. What do these behaviors actually look like? And what do they look like in the classroom instruction setting? What do they look like in the hallways? What do they look like in the cafeteria? What do they look like on the playground? What do they look like on the bus? And then we would actively teach to those things. It's part of that core of PBIS, very much behavior focused. So in PBIS, and I saw it show up on the RtI map over there, we have these percentages here. So an often kind of misunderstanding with these percentages in the triangle is that 80 to 90% of kids get this universal intervention. And then some kids get something a little different, a little bit more intense, and then a few kids get something very intense. And what the percentages actually represent is the percentage of the population that's expected to respond to that level of support. So all kids get universal, all students, all settings, prevention and proactive interventions and instruction. And we expect that 80 to 90% of the population will be good with that. Like, that's going to be enough support for me. I respond to that. And then some kids will need something a little extra. These targeted group interventions were intended to be very efficient, sometimes individual focused, sometimes group focused, like check-in, check-out, which is a very well-researched Tier 2 behavioral PBIS intervention. It's a little something extra to help that kid with the scaffold. Some social group skills interaction and intervention was happening at Tier 2 as well. Just a little bit more work in that area. Whereas Tier 3 was intended for the kids who were not responding to those prior 2 tiers of support. And the notion here was that 1 to 5% of our population would need something much more intensive, much more individualized. And this is where assessment-based and data-based actually get really ramped up. So the notion is, if you're getting Tier 3 supports, it's based on a particular kind of assessment called a functional behavioral assessment or a functional behavioral analysis. Both of those were in the mix. Now, this notion of function-based behavior definitely comes up earlier within the PBIS work. Function-based behavior. Best way I have to discern what the heck function-based behavior is to look at functions versus the behavior itself. So I got a call from a special ed teacher. She's working with this young girl, Rachel, and she says, I need a pantsing program for Rachel. Rachel is pantsing. Okay, I don't know what that is. What is a pantsing program? And she kept going on and kept going on. And it took me a little while, but she's like, during academic instruction, she's getting really frustrated, and all of a sudden she just stands up and she pulls down her pants. Oh, pantsing! Yeah, we don't have a book for that. Yeah, there's not a pantsing program. No. What we do is we ask, why is she pulling down her pants? Right? Is it, I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do this, the reading instruction. I do want to do this, because when I do this, I get out of this thing that I don't like. Right? That's the function behind the behavior. Is it, when she's doing large group reading instruction, I'm getting no attention, but when I drop my pants, I get attention. Right? Is it more about that kind of social interaction with peers and with adults? Is it attention-seeking function? What's the thing going on behind the behavior? Is it an attempt to communicate something? Right? I'm really hot right now. what's going on behind the behavior. So it's not, what do I do when a kid talks loudly in class? What's the function behind that? Why is the kid talking loudly in class? Right? So you're always asking why. For what end is the behavior being leveraged? Right? What does the kid get? What's the get for that? Right? So we're really interested in how everybody responds. I worked with another little boy who he had a very predictable sequence of escalating behaviors, right? And he would start off just kind of fidgeting, and then he would start tearing things up, materials, and then it would move to harming individuals, himself and other adults. And it was a very predictable sequence. And what he was communicating was, I'm frustrated and I need help right now, and I'm not getting it. And the behaviors would go up until somebody would intervene and help him. But usually by the time we got to the, I'm now hitting you, we're not sure what the heck we were trying to help you with to start with. So our big lesson is go back to the beginning when he was showing this, what was going on. So it's not only just function generally, but it's looking at that whole array of behavior. So we talk about kind of slow triggers, setting events, versus triggers where if X happens, you're going to get Y behavior. And slow triggers are, I didn't sleep well last night, I didn't eat breakfast, I haven't had enough coffee, right? Sets me up to be a little edgy, a little off. I might need some different supports. Right? So on the PBIS side, we look at the environment, we look at the personal history, we try to kind of figure out what the story is once we're up to that tier 3 intervention. Of course, we're paying attention to that earlier in the system, but this is the broad school-wide approach for behavior. So this was beginning to happen nationally, and there was a big push once you have universal in place, right? And we had nice checklists. People were using the school-wide evaluation tool, and we had fidelity measures. Are you doing these things well? Then we'll add on in your system. So the training approach was also very scripted. We train you, we coach you on this, and then we move up to add in the other areas of the system. RtI definitely started off in the academic area. So some people have innovated in the field and moved over to apply the tiered structures to behavior, but RtI started off primarily in the reading and math arenas. So you're completely right with your summaries here, right? That difference between kind of what was intended and what happened in the field and practice. RtI had some of the same basic structures that you've already named. Some things that are additional or different. Actually, let me back up over here. On the behavior side, part of the decision route for getting more support had to do with setting a decision rule for what would be the flag that a kiddo would need more assistance. Like Rachel's pantsing was kind of obvious. But how do you decide the kid who needs a little bit more like the check-in, check-out program? So we talked about tracking office discipline referrals as kind of the primary screening unit. And we would have a multi-gate screening system where teachers would weigh in on information and we'd be tracking numbers of office discipline referrals in order to make a decision to provide a little bit more support to a kiddo. So you had these gates to get into the other supports. On the academic side, those gates started with that universal instruction. So in RtI, there was a high push, particularly in early RtI models, there was a high push to talk about what's the evidence-based core curriculum that you're using, for example, in reading. And some of the early models of RtI had very strict guidelines on what counted as a good core curriculum and what didn't. Right? And so there was a very kind of scripted approach in that core instruction that was expected. One of the early tools was called the PET-R, the Planning and Evaluation Tool for School-Wide Reading Programs. And that PET-R tool has kind of evolved over time, but it was seen as one of the big cores behind RtI as far as one of the fidelity model checks. And the big push on universal was, do you have an evidence-based core curriculum, and then building from there. We also, in RtI, did universal screeners. How many of you are familiar with Dibbles and AimsWeb and, right? Like, we dibbled to death. Like, we're going to screen everybody, and then we're going to look at your numbers, and depending on what your numbers and your scores were in oral reading fluency, that determined what would happen to you next. And it was very what I would call data-driven in the early models. You've got this cut score, then you got this reading intervention. It's very one-for-one. And then we would, and you actually have it here in your language, data-driven, right? It was very data-driven. Same thing for getting then into the intensive interventions, right? We had these cut score gradations where actually Dibbles and AimsWeb, and they still do it, they would color code our kids for us. Okay, you're in the yellow, so you're gonna get tier 2 support. You're showing up in the red, so you're gonna get tier 3 support, right? I dibbled, I color coded my kids, and then I had these scripted interventions in the really early models of these things. And I'm poking a little fun there because it got us in trouble. It really got us in trouble. We took the profession out of teaching and we made you all technicians, right? And that was like we just bled the life out of good instruction. Like, look at the kid in front of you. What's going on? So same notions here about tiered supports. We had universal screeners. We had all students getting, kind of scripted time blocks, amounts of time, core evidence-based curriculum and instruction. And then based on your screening data and your response to the universal instruction, we would bump up the level of support. And there were kind of two things that were happening for tier 2 support in reading and in math. Some of it was supplemental instruction, a little bit extra dose of what happened in core, and some of it was very skill-based. So based on what your Dibble scores were and your AimsWeb scores were, you got sorted into the fluency group and the decoding group and the language group, and we intervened on that topic area. And we set a bar, an expectation, by X number of weeks, you'll be at this point in your progress. And we gave you little tests to progress monitor you, and then based on what your numbers were, we would decide, are we gonna keep doing this, or are we gonna switch it up and maybe move you to a different group? And then if you still weren't responding, we'd bump you up to tier 3 support, which in early models of RTI was just more time with a lot of the same instruction. So people talked about, on the RTI side, a 90-minute reading block, an additional 30-minute group intervention 3 to 5 times a week, and then another 30 to 60 minutes on top of that if you were getting tier 3 support in reading. So you could be spending 2.5 hours, per day. It was a really long day, 48.5 hours. Lot of reading instruction, a lot of reading intervention, and it was seen as strictly additive. Like, we do this in core, we do this separate thing in tier 2, we do this separate thing in tier 3. And it was very intervention and skill driven at that time. There wasn't necessarily an open conversation, at least in the early practice models, of what you were doing in tier 3 and how that related back to what was happening in tier 1. It could be completely disconnected, right? It was just intervene the boogers out of them, right? Like, just go for it. In practice, in some of the early models. Of course, none of you did any of that. I was part of that model, though. And once we got up to tier 3, we were testing the boogers out of you as well as intervening them out of you. We were running little tests every single week, and we still are big proponents of monitoring the progress and how kids are responding. And we want to make sure that those measures for progress monitoring are linked to the skills that you're trying to teach. Versus, like, here's the tier 3 assessment that we use all the time. Like, we don't have to test every area of reading every week. Like, what are the skills that we're working on? Let's monitor for that. And let's monitor for those skills, like in the area of reading, back in connected text. Right? Those are the two things we want to look at in progress monitoring. Do you have the skill? Can you apply the skill back when you're looking at real life texts? That whole generalization thing. All right. So far so good. This is all consistent. I'm seeing some extra note taking, so hopefully I clarified a few of the myths that come out with these models. RTI, we have here identifying specific learning disability. In some states, in RTIs it was rolled out, there was Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 special ed. Because it was really just about moving you through the tiers in order to see that you didn't respond, but we did provide you evidence-based instruction, thus we would identify you with a specific learning disability. And now we'd ship you over to get special ed interventions. That's how it practiced out in some places, not all places. But for some models of RTI, it was very much Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and then off to special ed. So while it was school-wide, it wasn't multiple systems all integrated in. right? There was still we did our piece, now you're the special educator, you go do your special boxes, right? Pull out your special interventions. Some other ways to look at this. Early models in Iowa for both behavior and academics had a little bit more fluidity in their thinking. Many of you have seen me do these graphics before, the moving kids. I love these graphics. With these graphics, we started to bring RtI and PBIS together, right? All kids were getting something in that core Tier 1 instruction, and we started to move away from, is it special ed, is it general ed, and we said, what are the resources that need to be allocated for any kid to get benefit? Behavior, reading, math, whatever the content areas are. So we thought about amount of resource needed here on your, that's the y-axis, right? And then this one's the x, right? Yeah, okay, good. Severity of educational need on the x-axis down here. And severity of educational need in the Iowa model was inclusive of both struggling students and accelerating students. So in the Iowa model, as they brought these together, they also moved out of it's only for those kids who are non-responders, which was that early language that we saw in both of these models. He's a non-responder, let's give him Tier 2. Right? And they were like, well, it's really not about that, because you could have a kid who's really over-responding if you want to sort them that way. So they were like, okay, let's allocate resources differently based on what the need is for individual kiddos, which still had some of the same basic frames. Good core instruction on the behavior side. We had our 3 to 5 behavioral expectations. We had those matrixed out. We had good teaching strategies for those. We still had evidence-based core curriculum. We weren't disbanding from that idea. And then we would do our screening 3 times a year, early in the year, hopefully within the first 4 to 6 weeks. Then moving out usually at that winter break point when people came back, and then toward the end of the year. And that data was our kind of prevention stance for all kids to say, we're just going to keep rechecking all kids, make sure nobody's at risk for failure here, or at risk for not getting enough challenge and getting bored to death in this class. So we still had our screening going on here, and that data informed some differentiation. Then, based on that data, we might say, here's a group of kids who need something extra, and sometimes we knew what the extra was, and sometimes we didn't know. So sometimes Tier 2 was more of a diagnostic instructional approach. I'm going to get in there and do something quick and be responsive, and then watch and see what happens. So some schools that I worked with, well, I'll actually hit that with the Tier 2 slide. So there was a add on, we're going to give you something extra, and then we usually still do a checking, some kind of progress monitoring twice a month. And then for some kiddos, in addition to Tier 1, they might get Tier 2, they might get a Tier 2, Tier 3 blending, they might just get an additional intensified intervention at Tier 3, so some kids were getting that Tier 3, and we would progress monitor weekly. You'll see all the pluses up here. It was all still going on. So you may or may not be getting a separate Tier 2 meeting as well as a Tier 3 meeting if you want to tier it that way. But you were getting the intensified supports. A little bit more fluid in the Iowa model. So I hit this, right? Tier 1 included screening. And all these slides, I think, are all on the little plug-in thing. Research-based, culturally responsive cores, universal design for learning differentiation, we've got all that in there. So in Tier 1, we would use our data to inform how we might bring together different kids to work together, and we started to bring together paying attention to things like, oh, well, when Angelica's working with Diana, they don't work together all that well, so let's not put them in the same group. Like we started to say, oh, behavior matters during academic instruction. Let's pay attention to that. So we started to factor in both data from behavior and data from academics to think about flexible groups over the course of the month, the year, and then make some decisions. Are we doing what we intended to do? So in both of these models, RtI and PBIS, and this has been carried forward into MTSS, we're constantly checking to see, did we provide what we intended to provide? Or at least that's how the model was intended. And when people didn't do those fidelity checks, they didn't see the gaps closing that were part of the research behind the model. So going back out to this, if you were implementing RtI or PBIS, but you were seeing your school-wide data show that like 35% of the kids were responding to tier 1, and 65% of the kids needed additional intervention. That's not an intervention problem. That's not a kid problem. That's a design of tier 1 problem. So the way that I frame it is you can't intervene your way out of bad instruction. If your numbers are such that you've got 65% or lower of kids responding at tier 1, you've got 35% or more of your population for whom you're feeling like we have to give additional interventions and supports to them in order for them to just meet the proficiency expectations, your problem is in tier 1. We got to go back to tier 1. What are the core good instructional approaches? So I always ask my schools now, in addition to having an evidence-based core curriculum, do you have an instructional playbook? How many of you are familiar with the work of Jim Knight? Oh, he's awesome. So Jim Knight talks about this construct of an instructional playbook, having a set of go-to, high-leverage, high-impact strategies and instructional approaches that you're going to expect all teachers to use across content areas. So direct instruction, good, high leverage. Cooperative learning, good, high leverage. Right? Retention, not high leverage, right? Sorting out your instructional approaches to figure out what's working for you, what's not. So one of the big consistent messages is similarities in PBIS and RtI, where they were talking about in a school-wide model, if we've got high percentage of kids who are not responding to tier 1, we have to reinvest in tier 1. That's the issue. Looking for the right tier 2 or tier 3 intervention for this kiddo is not the question we should be asking right now. Okay. And what we've now found out from the research is that these tier 2 and tier 3 interventions on both sides of these frames have even greater effect when they're provided on top of a solid core. They have a smaller effect size if the core is weak as well. So even if you get that one that has like the extra 5 stars, RtI approved banner on the box, and you're implementing it, it's going to maybe be 2 stars because you have a weak core. You're not going to get the same bump from it. Right? So we really want to pay attention to that core piece. Now, this was also intended to be responsive in that we would provide interventions and supports and then change what we were doing based on student data. This is another thing that kind of fell apart in the field. Kids were being sent off to tier 2 forever, for the year, right? We intended these intervention cycles to occur 3, 6, 8 weeks long, depending on your local system, right? But we saw kids who would be like, oh yeah, he's in tier 2 for the year. Like, just off they go. But we actually want to stop at some point in an intervention cycle and look at our data and say, okay, so here's our current grouping structure where we're addressing, this is our decoding group and our fluency group and a kid who kind of leaves the fluency group often because his math is off. We've got a group here that's working on background knowledge and schemas. We've got a group over here that's looking at multisyllabic words and decoding. So we've got our focused skill groups. And then maybe down here, a little closer to tier 1, we've got a group that's getting a reteach of some stuff that happened in tier 1. So we had this again, we started to get more and more fluid with a continuum and making sure it was built off of a solid core. Now those come out of PBIS and RtI, and they form a foundation for early inclusion work. And early inclusion work actually informed the initial designs in PBIS and RtI. We were seeing that kids, even with the most significant disabilities, were benefiting from being in core instruction versus just getting their whole day being tier 3 pull-out instructional and intervention programs. So this notion of responding now is to look at the data at the end of the cycle and to make determinations about, are all these kids continuing to get this support in this way, or does their data suggest we've got to move some things around? So we actually move some kids. Some kids are like, you're responding just great, let's move you back into tier 1 support for this content area, maybe this one's reading, and we're going to keep a watch on you. Like, have you ever done watch lists? You provide some intervention, you're like, I think he's stable, let's move him back to tier 1, but keep your eyes on that one. Keep your eyes there, right? So we got them on a watch list. And then other kiddos were like, oh my God, this entire group did not make progress this month or this intervention cycle. An entire group. If an entire group's not meeting the aim line, chances are the problem is not with the students. We've got a different thing going on. And this took us some while to figure out, and it goes back first and foremost to the fidelity question. Well, is that interventionist providing the intervention that was intended? That would be a question that we're asking. Did they provide it well? The other question we'd be asking is, did we mismatch all those kids? One of the working assumptions, in PBIS it was function-based behavior, in RtI it was skill-based identification. Do we have the kid in the right group? Do we have a kid who actually has decoding needs and we've got him in a fluency group? Like that may be why he's not responding right now. We've got a mismatch going on. So we've got to look at that. Is it fidelity in coaching? Do we have to switch them to a different group? Do we have to increase the intensity? So we've got some kids who are responding in different ways. Let's move them around. And then some kids we're going to add on a little bit more support. It grew to be a much more fluid system and a fluid model. To a point, and the same things apply in Tier 3. Same decisions, some kids are responding, we're going to put them down to less support, still monitoring our whole group's not responding in Tier 3. Do some kids need to move around to different interventions or supports for their system? So it's intended to be this fluid system, which moved us more and more away from Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, to everybody gets this, and then we kind of add and adjust and personalize. So it's become much more of a fluid model as we've moved to MTSS, where we've brought these two things together. George Sugai, how many of you are familiar with George Sugai's work? He's kind of freaking brilliant. And what Sugai helped us to think about was this notion that maybe the supports are even more nuanced than that when you look at an individual kid. And this actually came in from a lot of the inclusion work. This is where inclusion work was really helpful, because our early models of inclusion work were one kiddo at a time. I want this kid that we're going to work to include in this classroom, right? And we would do inclusion work at a class for a year, and then the kid would move to another class, and we'd start all over again. But it was all about including that individual kiddo, which forced us to look at what's the profile of support any one kid needs in their day. And one of the biggest tensions around this to this day is this notion of paraprofessional support. Like, I'll take that kiddo in my class if he comes with a para. If he doesn't come with a para, I'm not having him in my room. Well, most humans that I know do not need adult support for everything all day long. So George helped us think about looking at specific behavior and specific support needs. Same thing plays out in reading or math. Look at the particular reading behavior or math behavior. Where does support actually need to be matched for the kiddo? And it's probably not Tier 2 or Tier 3 all day long. So in this profile, you see somebody who doesn't need support at all, really, in basketball, social studies, or technology. When we get up to writing in Spanish, you know, a little kind of peer collaboration really helps this individual out, but it's still considered universal support. But when it comes to science and math, we're really needing to up our game for support. And hopefully there you're even getting more specific. Malcolm does really well right here in peer interactions when working with technology, individual play, but when it comes to problem solving or in anger management, we've really got to up our levels of support. So you can think about your own lives or any kiddo, and now we're thinking about much more tailored, nuanced notions of support, which starts to bring together this inclusion RtI PBIS piece. Okay, so let's stop for a moment. I think I have like 20 minutes left-ish. 15 minutes left, that's fine. Because this is all the foundation for what MTSS is, and we're just about there. Questions on the basics of these different models? I saw some writing in between, so hopefully we've hit some of the questions that came out.
What does that look like?
Great. So Diana's like already nodding the answer for you. She's in it. She's in it. Yeah. Right. So when you identify your school-wide expectations, you then matrix out what do those look like in a classroom. So I'm guessing that that's what you've done in your hallways and your cafeteria. You're like, respect and responsibility looks like this. Safety looks like this in these settings. We do the same thing in the classroom. And what some teachers have done is then form classroom agreements around those look-fors, like have everybody in the class sign it in some way to signal that they've been taught it and that that's what they're working toward. And then the teacher sets up the classroom arrangements and the instructional strategies to support those behaviors. So you actually,
Schools on the same page for that specific.
that's the beauty of it.
Okay.
That's when we get the higher effect, when everybody's teaching the same behavioral expectations, which gets us out of, when I'm in Diana's class, I have to do this thing, and when I'm in Ian's class, I have to do this thing, and when I'm in Angelica's class, I have to do this thing, right? Like, we want to take that off the kid. What are the standard expectations across the room? Yeah, they're across the school. Yes, there are going to be some nuances, but they should all come back to the school-wide expectations.
Like your own behavior, you know what I mean? Does each class still have their own behavior system put in place as well?
I've seen both and. The real push is to standardize the general frame for behavioral support across the school. So you don't have one class doing a pull a card, pull a ticket, and somebody else is doing, what's that online one where you track the behaviors? Dojo, right? Because now when they go to the playground, they've got a different system. So we want to kind of narrow back down and get everybody on the same page here, which also then sets teachers up to get good ideas from one another because we're all running a common system. Right. Great question. Okay. MTSS, in our model, and this is where I'm going to explicitly bring in the inclusion into this conversation. At the Swift Education Center, we define inclusion in terms of equity-based inclusive education, with MTSS being at the heart of that. Good, high-quality instruction and support, personalized to kiddos, is at the heart of this. So what we learned in the inclusion decades is that when there was good classroom instruction happening, it was easier to get kids included. When there was universal design for learning at play in certain classrooms, we saw kiddos like who Paula was describing this morning starting to show us things that we didn't think that they knew. Right? We had the kiddo who could go into the library and signal, I want to read, by sitting down in the red beanbag chair, and people knew that. When we have a common system for instruction and support across the building, it changes the game. Right? So Paula's running out of breath from class to class, trying to figure out which sticky, which koosh ball, which enlarged print do I need to throw into this classroom. And she's got some kind of framework going on in her head, but it's not shared with all of her teachers. In MTSS, that framework is shared across all teachers. There's a common framework when we talk about UDL. Move up to the UDL slide, right? So UDL, guiding principles and checkpoints. Everybody in the building would know the basics of UDL. So that when she comes in, she's like, okay, so there's some engagement issues going on in class with Brian right now, and it looks like some of the content doesn't feel personally relevant. It's not hitting his interests. Let's start with recruiting Brian's interests in these topics that you're teaching to in class. Yesterday, I told a quick story about the student Jack that I worked with. He had a passion for trains. Soon as the teacher figured out he had a passion for trains, she could bring trains as an interest into lots of her core instruction. If it fits back into common language, then it's not, here's what I do for Jack, and here's what I do for Matthew, and here's what I do for Denise. It's, I recruit the interest of all my students. Now I've got a common frame. Makes it much more doable, right? So on your back wall over there, it says extra work hours. Yeah, if you don't have common frameworks, it's going to be a lot of extra work hours. Because then it's all about Jack, and it's just all about that one kid, and we want to pull it back to multi-tiered system of support for all kiddos. So having common frames for universal design. This can also be a framework for differentiation, or you can use like a Tomlinson framework, content, process, and product for differentiation. Big push there, and it goes back to your question around the behavior systems, is having it be common across the system. So we think about MTSS as the instructional heart, and then we want to think about what's the leadership and educator support that goes with teachers being able to do that. We saw that it was easier to include kids in buildings where there was strong, positive administrative leadership. When the principal was beating the streets saying, how's it going for you having Jack in your class? Like, that made a difference. When there was a school leadership team who was on board with the notion that we were going to include Jack in the building, it made a difference. when educators had job-embedded coaching, somebody working alongside them to build new skill sets. That made a difference. Versus the, here's Jack, good luck, right? And off I go. I worked with a teacher, Mindy, who had kind of been thrown a student, and then everybody kind of ran away from her. 3 months later, she had never been oriented to the IEP, never been taught how to communicate with the kid, not how to adapt materials to him. So the paraprofessional basically was just making stuff up as she went, sitting with him in the back of the room, totally disconnected from everything else in the room. Not the classroom teacher's fault, and I wouldn't call that inclusion. So we want to think about educator support as part of this. An integrated educational framework is that shifting of service delivery, so paying attention to things like co-teaching, collaborative teaching structures with the planning time that's required built into the master schedule. So integrated educational framework is what's the school-wide structures that will help these behaviors occur for the adults. What's the school culture and climate? You know, you've walked into those buildings where you can feel it as soon as you walk in. And you're like, ooh, it feels good here. Like people greeted me and there are like signs that let me know what's going on here, and like I'm already feeling the vibe. And then other buildings you walk into and you're like, oh crap. I feel a little anxious just standing here in the entryway. Like you get a vibe right off the bat. That school culture makes a difference. The climate and culture for the adults, that's part of this. Family and community engagement, another supporting area of MTSS. Right? Having two-way conversations with families, right? It's really helpful if the family could have sent into Mindy a short list of Jack's likes. He really digs trains. Wave a train in him once a day, you're going to be golden, right? Like that would have been really good to know. Can we set up two-way communication around kids and their instructional needs and around like family voice in the larger system? Our schools are the service agency to the local community. What do they want that service agency to be for them? I worked with a great superintendent about 3 years ago through our work in the Swift Center, and we do this whole design and visioning process, and it starts off at the school and then it goes out to the community in the way that we had scaffolded it. And he said, no. I'm starting in the community. We're not going to start by asking teachers, what's your ideal school? We're going to build that off of what families want. And he did a bunch of community cafes and got input saying, when your kid graduates from our schools, from this school system, what do you want to happen for him or her? What do you want in place? What do you want their daily experience to be like? That then drove the local design. That's community engagement. That's family engagement. And this one that has lots of big words over here, this is really about school district partnerships. If principals feel abandoned, that's going to, by their district office, chances are that's going to trickle out to other staff members, not feeling like they're getting the support they need from the principal. So we've got to work on the school to district relationship. So there are core elements like good instruction, teams coming together to look at data about kiddos, teachers working in a prevention stance. I want to prevent as much as I can and be proactive in my first best instruction, right? These are common across MTSS. And then there are supporting domains of work that help that occur. I can have the best core curriculum in the world, but if I don't have the job-embedded teaching and learning for it, my own professional development, I'm not going to be able to pull it off. If I'm not getting the right information from families, I can't personalize my instruction. Right? So these all support this HEART, multi-tiered system of support, to happen. And within MTSS, we think about the universal design and the differentiation, but then we think about integrating across content areas and across systems. So this is, I think, the big thing that's different about MTSS from RtI or PBIS, and I'm already seeing in the literature, I'm seeing it in I'm seeing workshops that are now labeled MTSS-B and MTSS-A. Like in this MTSS workshop, you will learn about academic interventions. Yeah, we used to call that RtI. MTSB. In this one, you'll learn about universal positive behavioral supports. Well, that's PBIS. That's not MTSS, right? So those are components of MTSS. So we want to be careful as you monitor the field. Look for flags in the play, right? Like if you see that MTSS B label, that's probably PBIS work, which may or may not be helpful to you if that's what you need. It's probably not going to teach you the gestalt of MTSS. So integration is across those content areas. Integration is across systems. So now we think about specially designed instruction for kids who are getting special education services. SDI, if you look up the legal definition of it, it talks about methods, strategies, products, teaching processes, and adaptations and modifications to content. It's the same language that describes differentiation. If you put the two definitions side by side, a differentiation definition next to the legal definition for specially designed instruction, they're the same. They're basically the same. Some words in other orders. So we want to bring together those systems. Special ed in an integrated, comprehensive MTSS framework is not a separate thing. You don't go through tiers of support and then we send you out to special ed. You think about infusing the specially designed instruction throughout the day, throughout the content areas. And we recognize in MTSS the whole kid in front of us. So Kent McIntosh and Steve Goodman have a book out that's in the book sale place here. And really early on in the book, they have this map of 4 pathways to both academic and behavioral concerns for students. And they really lay out, I think, a very nice description of how you can start off with a behavioral concern and wind up with an academic concern, right? Kids acting out in class, I keep sending you out of class because you're acting out, and now you're not experiencing the instruction that's occurring repeatedly, and now you're behind in that unit. And then that rolls over into the next unit, and now you're behind academically, and there's something going on for you behaviorally. So we started off with just behavior, and now we've got an academic issue as well. Vice versa, kid's got a lot of math anxiety, has not been really successful in math, and now he's starting to act out as soon as he gets into the math class. Now we got some social emotional stuff going on when it started off as a math issue, but because I didn't do the prevention work to identify the math issue early on, now we got social emotional stuff going on for the kiddo. So in MTSS, we want to integrate all these systems to set them up. So at the heart of it, I think the biggest difference in MTSS from RtI or PBIS or inclusion is the constellation of the teams. I really think that that's the special sauce. It all comes back to the people. It all comes back to the people. What they believe, what expertise they're bringing to the game, what they know about that kiddo, that matters. So your teams that are coming together to lead MTSS in your building represent the various stakeholders that are invested in your school-wide MTSS system. Your teams at grade levels are going to represent the various aspects that you need to address when you integrate across general and special ed, when you integrate across behavior, social, emotional, and reading and math and other contents. And then your expanded grade teams are going to bring in the expertise that you need to support figuring out the right support for a kiddo. So support to support, right? Support adults in order to support kids. I don't expect all classroom teachers to know how to conduct a functional behavioral assessment. We're down to like 2 minutes. Okay. So I might have school psych, social workers engaged in a tier 3 team who are going to be providing that expert support, right? So think about the various expertise sources that you need once we get into these teams. I think teams are really the special sauce in MTSS. Okay. Let me just show you 2 of your handouts that I would like you to play with for homework to do sense making of this. Homework on a Friday? Yes. So one of the handouts in the little plugger memory stick thing there shows our framework. And what I'll invite you to do is to take a look at the framework and start listing off, here's things we already do in our building. Here's stuff we already have going on, right? So you can flip through and you're going to have one page that has There we go. You're going to have the first page in the handout. It's going to give you like specific indicators that would be things you'd want to have in place for that feature or that domain of MTSS and the supports for those components of MTSS. Kind of take a look through there and circle ones you feel like, yeah, we have that, we have that, we have that. Build from that as you're looking at it. So that's in your packet. You can identify your strengths. You'll see one that says strengths on it, and then you'll have one that says opportunities. And opportunities may not be just the stuff you're currently sucking at. It could be like, wow, we're really good in this, and we could grow it a little bit more, right? So opportunities are not necessarily weaknesses. The other thing that's in your packet that I'll encourage you to look at is called our FIA, the Fidelity Integrity Assessment. And what it does is it gives you a set of observable indicators across MTSS as a comprehensive integrated system. It gives you 22 things to look at. Very specific descriptive look-fors that you can bring back to your school leadership team. And you can actually complete as a self-assessment to get a baseline of where your whole school-wide system is relative to equity-based inclusive education that leverages MTSS at the heart of it. So you'll have an item description, and then you'll have kind of a stages of your development description. Find the description, the look for that best matches your school, and then look to the next one over, if there is one, if you're not already in a 3, to see what you might start working on next. That can be some kind of help for getting it into practice. All right, she's shutting me down, so we're done. We're actually a minute over time. Thank you for staying late.